Welcome, dear students, to this interesting session on peasant movements in India. To begin with, the overview of the session is we will be doing the meaning of peasant movement, causes of peasant movements, different peasant movements, impact and effect of these peasant movements on the political scenario of India, and at the end of the session, we will summarize what we have done. To begin with, the peasant movement is basically a social movement, just like we have movements on feminism, we have movements on Marxism. Social movements are processes for social progression. These are broadly considered as sustained, organized or collective efforts aiming to change in thoughts, beliefs, values, attitudes, relationships and major institutions in society or to resist any change in societal arrangements. Social movements emerge as manifestations of collective discontent against existing social, economic and political arrangements. So basically, social movements aim at two things, either to bring about change or to resist change. Now that brings us to an important question as to why do we need to study peasant movement? The answer lies in the fact that our society's very rubric is agrarian. The economy of our country is agrarian. The majority of Indian population depends on agrarian activities, in spite of the very fact that a lot of emphasis is given to promoting the growth of industries and the manufacturing sector. Deep down in the heart of every man desires to have a land of his own to cultivate. This land-man relationship is the reason we need to comprehend what is peasant movement and why do we need to study peasant movement. So those who depend on agriculture are differentiated in terms of the relationship with the ownership of land, such as absentee landlords, supervisory agriculturist, owner cultivator, sharecroppers, tenants and landless labourers. So this relationship is on the basis of ownership of land and man. Agrarian movements in India can be broadly classified into two categories. Peasant movements in India, the first category includes the movement related to poor, small and marginal agriculturists, whose economic condition and survival is mainly attached to the agriculture and are termed as peasant movements. The second category includes those of more affluent agriculturists who can produce sufficient surplus from the agriculture. So there are different sociologists who have given definitions and who have described what is peasant struggles. One of them, A.R. Desai, preferred to call this peasant struggle in the colonial period as peasant movement and the post-independence era as agrarian struggle. Now the difference between the peasant struggle and agrarian struggle, according to A.R. Desai, is the phrase agrarian struggle is meant to convey that it involves not only peasants but other sections of the population as well. So that brings us to another important question as to who is a peasant. Historically, the roots of the word peasant can be traced back to medieval Europe, where it was used to refer to rural poor, rural residents, agricultural labourers and the common people, rural inhabitants, whether or not involved with agriculture. From time immemorial, social scientists have dealt with the position of peasantry in India. There are sociologists, there are anthropologists, there are historians who have described peasants in their own meaningful ways. But the economic term, they are identified to be small producers for their own consumption, and this fits well in the definition of a peasant, that he is a small producer who works for their own consumption and sustains cultivators, who produce predominantly for the need of the family rather than to make a profit. However, historically, peasants have always borne the brunt of the extreme forms of subordination and oppression in society. The specific socio-economic conditions of their existence have largely shaped the roles of the peasantry in social change and transformation. Changes in the modes of production in agriculture have disturbed the traditional agrarian relationship, which also led to peasant unrest. So, one of the basic reason of the peasant unrest, peasant uprisings or peasant revolt has been the change in the means of production in agriculture and the traditional agrarian relationship. The history of agrarian unrest can be traced back to the first quarter of 1920s. The rural sociologists have used various terms for peasant unrest. For some, the unrest is called as peasant struggle, for some it is called as peasant uprising, and some others call it as a peasant revolution, and few other sociologists call it simply a movement. So, having said that, we come to the history of peasant movement, which can be traced to the economic policies of the Britishers. It is only during the colonial period that we come to know about the peasant uprisings, and that is why the main cause of these peasant movements is the economic policies of the Britishers, which have brought about many changes in the Indian agrarian system. The consequences of the British colonial expansion were felt the most by the Indian peasantry, and it rose in revolt from time to time. They attacked not only the Britishers, but also the new zamindars, landlords and moneylenders. Scholars have viewed these peasant movements as a distinct variant of social movements. We talked about social movements in the very first slide. So, it is the peasant movement is a distinct variant. There is a difference in this particular form of social movement, and how it is different from other movements. It is in terms of changes in the organization of production and class conflict. At an operational level, the peasant movement has been conceptualized as organized and collective effort of the peasantry to bring about changes in the pattern. So, this particular peasant movement, which comes under social movement, was to bring about certain changes in what? In ownership of land, control and use of land, the share of agriculture produce, wage structure, credit and institutional support system, in other aspects of social economic life that have subjugated them in agrarian society. So, under British rule, changes in the modes of production and agriculture disturbed the agrarian relationships, which led to peasant unrest. The land became a marketable commodity, and commercialized agriculture developed during the late 19th century. This led to the corrosion of the traditional bonds, thus providing possibilities of rebellion. So, commercial production started rather than food crops. With the commercialization of agriculture between 1860 and 1920, the landlords who used to collect rent in cash started collecting rent in grain, the price of which was high. The peasants suffered from high rents, illegal levies, arbitrary evictions, unpaid labor in zamindari areas, and in rotwari areas, the government itself levied heavy land revenue. And thus, the peasants were left with no other option but for the uprisings or the rebellion. So, that brings us to the causes of peasant movements. What exactly went wrong and why these peasant uprisings or revolt took place? The first one is the high rents. The second, illegal levies, arbitrary evictions, unpaid labor, heavy land revenues, repeated famine, tyranny of zamindars and illegal exactions. Now, what do we mean by illegal exactions? The illegal exactions were forcefully taking out money or crop from the peasants. They were not ready to give, but they were forcefully done by the zamindars or moneylenders or the landlords. So, what happened? The overburdened farmer, fearing loss of his only source of livelihood, often approached the local moneylenders to made full use, and these moneylenders made full use of the farmer's difficulties by extracting high rates of interest on the money lent. Often, the farmers had to mortgage his land and cattle. Sometimes, the moneylenders seized the mortgage belongings. Gradually, over large areas, the actual cultivators were reduced to the status of tenants at will, shop croppers and landless labourers. The tyranny of zamindars, along with the exuberant rate of interest by the Britishers, led to a series of spontaneous peasants' uprising in different parts of the country during this period. The periodic reoccurrence of famines, coupled with economic depression during the last decade of the 19th century, further aggravated the situation in rural areas and consequently led to numerous peasant revolts. So, what do we see? We see that finally what happened, what culminated into the causes which gave birth to peasant uprisings were the financial causes. The money lenders who tried to use their situations and made the life very difficult for them, because they were not able to pay even the interest. The interest was so heavy that the peasants were not able to pay the interest, forget about the loan amount that was given to them. And finally, they turned out to be tenants at will, sharecroppers and landless laborers. So, with this we come to the important peasant movements. Some of the very important peasant movements are indigo cultivators movement, Deccan riots, Champaran Satyagraha, Kheda peasant struggle, the Bardoli movement in Gujarat, Mopla rebellion in Malabar, Telangana movement, Tebaga movement in Bengal, Kisan Sabha movement and Eka movement. Now, if we talk about the peasant movement's timeline, we can broadly, there are sociologists and historians and economists who have defined it in a very different manner, but if we talk about the timeline, I have, for the convenience, have divided them into 3 parts. The first is before the revolt of 1857, the peasant movements which took place before the revolt of 1857, that is the Rangpur revolt and Paika rebellion. Paika rebellion is nowadays called as the first war of independence. It should be considered, this is what the people are saying, the historians are saying, that the Paika rebellion should be considered as the first war of independence. The second phase is before Gandhi, that is after the revolt of 1857, but before Gandhi came on the scene of Indian political scenario. So, rebellions like Indigo rebellion or Deccan revolt or Pavana revolt comes under this category. And the third is the Gandhian era, when Gandhi entered the scene of the political scene of India, and how he became part of these peasant movements. Now, a very interesting fact that needs to be dealt here is that these peasant movements, they had no leaders as such. They were very disoriented. But later on, when Gandhi came on the scene, many of the political leaders, many of the freedom fighters became part of these peasant movements, which helped both the parties. The peasants got oriented and there was somebody who could address their problems, and secondly, the freedom fighters got masses along with them, because till that time the masses were not part of this freedom struggle. So, it helped both of them, the peasant movement also and the freedom struggle also. So, with this we come to one of the most important peasant movement, and that is indigo cultivators movement, which happened in 1859 to 1860. Now, indigo planting in Bengal dates back to 1777, when Louis Bernard, a Frenchman, introduced it to the Indians. One important fact which needs to be told about indigo is that the farmers they were very reluctant to cultivate indigo, and the reason was, once it is cultivated, the field becomes infertile, and that was the most important reason that why the farmers were not very keen on cultivating indigo. But in that case, what happened was, the Indian farmers were forced to grow indigo, which comes under the category of a cash crop instead of food crops. There was no one to save them from brutalities of indigo planters. If the farmers refused to grow indigo, their properties were either destroyed, mortgaged or confiscated. Farmers were beaten, they were jailed to force them to sell indigo at non-profitable rates. If the farmers refused to grow indigo, they and their family members were tortured. If the farmers approached court, the European judges granted no relief. By an act of 1833, the planters were given more power to oppress the farmers. Now, what is important here is why the European planters forced the Indian farmers to grow indigo. Indigo was a very coveted dye, it is a natural dye, it has fast color. So, the Europeans they were producing this dye that was not fast in color, but this Indian indigo was fast in color, and it is a very coveted dye, and that is why the Europeans forced Indians to grow this. Now, the Indians were tortured, the Indian farmers were tortured both ways. They were forced to grow indigo, they never wanted to grow, but they were forced to grow it, and secondly, it was brought from the Indian farmers by European at a very low rate. So, they were at the loss on both the ends. They never wanted to grow it, but they were forced to cultivate it, and secondly, they were forced to sell it to the European planters at a very low price. Now, this particular slide shows you the area of indigo revolt in Bengal during 1859 to 62. You can see the areas in blue is the areas where the indigo revolt took place. And this particular slide shows you the dye, the blue dye, and the end product, which is so beautiful, and that is why it was such a coveted dye that everybody wanted to buy this, especially the Europeans. So, aggrieved with the continuous torture and oppression, the peasants finally stood against the oppressors, that was the Britishers, in the Nadia district of Bengal Presidency. The revolt was led by Bishnu Charan Biswas and Digambar Biswas. They refused to grow indigo. European planters reacted by increasing the rent and evicting the farmers. The strike spread to other places in Bengal. The British authorities, along with a few local zamindars, mercilessly slaughtered the peasants. The revolt soon engulfed the whole of Bengal. Bengal press played a very important role. Press emerged as a very important tool. Harish Chandra Mukherjee, Sisir Kumar Ghosh played a very significant role. Deenbandhu Mitra's play Neel Darpan, the mirror of indigo, reflected the peasant feel. This particular play, Neel Darpan, talked about the trauma, the pain, the feelings which the peasants were feeling, and it sort of spread the awareness about the pain of the peasants to the local people. Now, we can see that there were two important people who led the revolt, Bishnu Charan Biswas and Digambar Biswas. But what is important is the press backed this peasant revolt, and it was reflected in the newspapers and in the other form of literature, like we saw the play by Deenbandhu Mitra, and this helped a lot to these indigo and peasant revolt. The government was forced to appoint an indigo commission to look into the matter. This revolt was one of its kind, first revolt of peasants against the Britishers in terms of economic and social conflicts. It was the result of the anger that piled up for years against the oppressor and has oppressive policies. The revolt laid the foundation for many other peasants' uprisings to come in a very significant way. It is important to note that the indigo revolt was in no way a class struggle. The conflict was between peasants and Britishers and not peasants and zamindars. The revolt was a success as government issued a notification that no farmers shall be forced to cultivate indigo against his or her will. So, what is important here to note down is that it was not a class conflict. This peasant movement was not a class conflict, but it was a conflict between the Britishers and peasants. It was not a conflict between peasants and zamindars. So, that is how it becomes important. It gave a message to others that yes, we can stand against Britishers. But again, one important thing that needs to be noticed here is that the peasants revolted against the economic policies of the Britishers. They never wanted to throw Britishers out of the country. They were only revolting against the economic policies, as they never wanted to cultivate indigo or never wanted to give it on such a lower price. So, this is something which needs to be kept in mind in this indigo revolt. The second very important revolt is the Deccan riots 1875. The Deccan riots of 1875 highlight the social transformation brought about in rural Maharashtra in western India during the first 5 decades of British rule. Britishers had introduced the Rotwari settlement as a system of land revenue. The riots suffered heavy taxes. The peasants found themselves in a vivacious network of moneylenders. These moneylenders were mostly Gujaratis and Marwaris, and they were not Maharashtrians. Crash in cotton prices after the end of American Civil War in 1864 is also one of the reasons of Deccan riots. Government decision to increase land revenue by 50% in 1867 is also one of the reasons of Deccan riots and succession of bed harvest. They started a social boycott movement against the moneylenders. Now, what is important in the causes of Deccan riots is the Rotwari settlement, as you all must be knowing about the very fact that the government, this Rohitwadi system settles the system in which there is a direct connection between the cultivators and government. The government directly collects taxes from the cultivators and it is collected annually. Now, the most important reason why this Deccan riot peasant movement took place was because the money lenders, they were not Maharashtrians, but they were Gujaratis and Marwadis. An important again reason is the crash in cotton prices. America was the biggest supplier of cotton, but when the war started, the American Civil War started in 1861, the cotton supply ended to Europe. So, the Britishers told the Indians to grow more cotton plants. So, they did that, they were given loans for that and they did that. But later on, when the war ended in 1864, the Britishers did not buy the cotton, and that is why there was crash in the cotton prices. The farmers have invested their hard money in that, and that was a biggest loss. Then the second reason, the government increased the land revenue by 50%, and the succession of bad harvest in the form of famine, drought or less rain. And that is why the Deccan riots took place. The rioters said that they will socially boycott the money lenders. It was not only the peasants, but the washermen, the sweepers, the barbers. They said we will not help or we will not work for the money lenders. The social boycott movement soon turned out into a peasant riot with a systematic attack on money lenders, houses and shops. The object of the rioters was to obtain and destroy the bond, decrees, etc. in the possession of the creditors. Though the government was successful in suppressing revolt, still Deccan Riots Commission was set up, and on the basis of its report submitted in 1878, Deccan Agriculturist Relief Act was passed in 1879. So, the significance of the movement is the Deccan Riots of 1875 were, however, very extraordinary in the sense that they were the only massive uprisings of peasants against money lenders in the long history of Western India during British period. They were epoch-making in the agrarian history of Western India. The riots are of special interest to the social historians since they hinged upon relationship between two important and well-defined rural social groups, namely the cultivators and money lenders. So, it was sort of a class conflict, class struggle between the money lenders and the cultivators. This brings us to another important peasant movement, the Champaran Satyagraha. Now, this again you have to be reminded of the very fact that this time Gandhi came on the scene of the politics. The land rent was increased. The peasants were compelled by the European planters to grow indigo, which restricted their freedom of cultivation. The peasants were forced to devote the best part of the land to cultivate crops according to the wishes of the landlord. The payment of wages was meagre to the peasants, which was not sufficient to earn their livelihood. The peasants of Champaran were living under miserable conditions and were suffering from abject poverty. The peasantry of Champaran suffered a lot at the hands of European planters, landlords and government officials. Now, Gandhi returned to India in 1915 and took a while to settle in. However, he was not one to remain far from the action and soon started championing the cause of the peasants. The Champaran Satyagraha was the first movement that Gandhi led on his return from South Africa, which was followed by a Khera Satyagraha in 1918. The peasants of Champaran district of North Bihar were protesting against the white indigo planters, and Gandhiji, who returned from South Africa at this time, wanted to practice his non-cooperation and Satyagraha in India, and the people of Champaran accepted his leadership. But the movement later on turned violent at Chauri Chaura, and Gandhiji was not very happy with this incident. However, the Champaran struggle is considered part of the national movement, and Champaran Satyagraha took place in April 1917. The movement has led to certain important outcomes. The Champaran Agrarian Act was passed, assented by the Governor General of India on 1st May 1918. The ideology of non-violence had given much strength to the peasants who participated in the movement. The movement also contributed to the growth of nationalism. With this, we come to a very, very important peasant movement, that is the Mopla movement. In the 1859, Mopla movement is a movement which though started in 1850, but the main movement was in 1921. So there were certain incidences of conflicts from 1850, but the culmination point was in 1921. So, in the 1850-1900 period, we witnessed a series of Mopla uprisings, which are also called as Malabar uprisings, because it started in Malabar. As the Janami landlords, who were Hindu landlords, backed by the police, law courts and revenue officials, tightened their grip over the Mopla peasants, who were basically Muslims, and later rebelled against the landlords and the British. It is not surprising to see how what was essentially a rich-poor conflict between the Janami landlords, who were Hindus, as I said earlier, and the Mopla peasants, who were Muslims, were given distinct communal colouring by the colonial states, since the landlords were Hindus and the peasants were Muslims. So, the Mopla movement in 1921 were Muslim tenants, and they agitated against Hindu landlords and Britishers. The major grievances of the Mopla tenants were insecurity due to unfavourable land tenure, due to which Mopals could be ejected from their land without any appropriate notice, high renewal fee fixed by the Janamis, and high rent fixed for Moplas and discriminating them against Hindu tenants. The Mopla demanded a change in legislation that defined the tenant-landlord relationship. Soon, the Mopla movement became part of the Khilafat movement. Gandhi, Maulana Azad, Shaukat Ali and other leaders addressed this issue. But with the arrest of the national leaders, the leadership of the Mopla movement went into the hands of the local leaders of Mopla. By December 1921, the Moplas lost the sympathy of general Malabar population because of the communal flavour, and Mopla rebels were isolated, and it became easy for the Britishers to repression. With this, we come to the peasant movement, which started after independence, that is 1946 to 1952, the Telangana movement. It was fight against the feudal oppression of the rulers and local landlords of Andhra Pradesh. The agrarian social structure of Hyderabad state under Nizams was very oppressive. The Jagirdars, Deshmukh, locally known as Dora, had immense power at the local level because of the privileged economic and political status, and they could easily subject the poor peasantry to extra economic corrosion known as veti or forced labour, which is also called as begar. Under this system, the Jagirdars and Deshmukh could force a family to cultivate the land and other works that would continue from generation to generation. The movement led by the communists began in Nalgonda district in 1946, spread to the neighbouring states and finally engulfed the whole of the Telangana region. The movement took a revolutionary turn in 1948 when the peasants formed an army and started fighting guerrilla war, and in this guerrilla war it was man, women, children, everybody participated. This was the biggest peasant guerrilla war in modern India history, affecting more than 2,500 villages. So they had finally they had to face the brutal oppression, and because India was independent at that time, the Indian army took over and the movement fizzled out. So there are certain impacts of this revolt. But as I have discussed in every slide, the impact of the revolt of the peasant movement, but the overall, all the movement, the peasant movement that took place, and what is the impact, what is the effect of those movements on the political scenario of India are, these disturbances received a great deal of attention. It made people aware of the problems of the peasants. It brought peasants from the periphery to the center stage. As a major crisis in agrarian history, they provide the occasion for the study of change and conflict in rural society. The peasant movements created an atmosphere for post-independence agrarian reforms because most of the national leaders became part of this peasant movement before independence. So, they knew the problem of these peasants very clearly, and that is why these peasant movements became the founding stones for most of the agrarian reforms. And they eroded the power of the landed class, thus adding to the transformation of the agrarian structure. So, in this session we have discussed what is a social movement, who is a peasant, some of the crucial features of peasant movements in Indian society. We started with a conceptual discussion on the peasant and peasant movement. The role of peasants in movements has also been touched upon. The social background and causes for the emergence and manifestation of peasant movements. A few of the prominent peasant movements and the impact of the peasant movement on society at large is also discussed. Thank you so much.